ladies and gentlemen. We meet here at a university noted for knowledge, under the auspices of the Knight Wallace Programme noted for leadership, in a country noted for innovation, and, to borrow from John F. Kennedy, we stand at a juncture of history when we are in need of all three. But first, let me say how delighted I am to be here, and I'm particularly honoured to be here on this occasion. Both Kimberly and I owe a great debt to the Knight Wallace Programme and to its astute leader, Professor Charles Eisendrath, to Birgit Rick, the Deputy Director of the programme, to all at Wallace House, and to this great place of learning. The Knight Wallace programme helped me to transition from an investigative reporter to an author and to a news manager. And it was during my year here in 2005-2006 that I began to contemplate the future for the profession I hold dear. For the world of newspapers is very different now. Different from the time when, as a young reporter in a smoke-filled room positioned over a busy butcher shop, I bashed out reports on a typewriter for the Longford News, a tiny newspaper in rural Ireland. Different from the time I got my first break on The Age, a daily newspaper in Melbourne, Australia, and I had to pretend I could turn on a computer. Different in that now the modern newspaper reporter holds in his hands the power to travel the world with the movement of a finger, and yet the same revolutionary technology that has transformed the power of reporting has in itself become an issue around the world. We dare not forget today that we are the last stragglers of a once great army, where once great and powerful newspapers dotted the landscape of every big town and city. There now remains many fewer, tempered by buyouts, racked by poor morale, and often peopled by those unwilling or unable to help themselves, by those who just don't seem to realise their proud and ancient calling is the way forward out of the morass. The odd thing about this new world we find ourselves in is that newspapers have more readers than ever. The content we create is more popular than ever. Even among the young people, popular wisdom says we have lost. The problem is that fewer of these readers are paying for their news because most newspapers don't charge for their online content, and the advertising revenue they thought they could attract by simply replicating the print product online simply hasn't materialised. As a working journalist, the problems newspapers are experiencing from the threat of the internet are never far from my mind. My sense of urgency comes not only from belonging to the profession, but from growing up with newspapers in their current paper form. I call to mind those victims whose stories have been brought to light, whose twisted tales and damaged lives have been improved through highlighting the random injustice of systemic failure. And I call to mind those who, though unaffected directly by injustice, are nevertheless beneficiaries of good newspaper journalism, beneficiaries of the democracy and feeling of surprise and sense of community that good journalism brings, because insensitivity towards others is surely the road to a selfish society. Don't believe anyone who says people don't care about newspapers. People from all over the world care deeply about them and are willing them to survive. For in every country, it is not just the reporters who are central to the survival of their journalistic legacy, it is the communities they serve. But as I reflect on the challenges we now face, I also reflect on the mistakes we are making. I reflect on the error that reporters have for so long been content to follow broken formulas, when it would make more sense that reporters should, above all else, be taught to innovate and to question. I reflect on the possibility that the greater the need for change increases, the greater our mistakes unfold. For it is precisely the dramatic changes in the way that journalism is being delivered to the community through the internet that should allow us to see the possibilities of the change in our relationship with the community. Having recently written a book about a con man, I can't help thinking that in many ways the internet appeared as a kind of con man to the world of newspapers. The thing about a con man is that he can find his way into all the facets of your life that you have tried to keep hidden, what assumptions are loose, which postulations may not hold. The con is brutal. It recognises our weaknesses and what we hold dear, and exploits the concealed truths that we most shrink from. But the power of the con is not just about greed and manipulation. The con man also often appeals to certain impulses in people. He not only steals money from his victims, he also steals their trust, and that makes him feel ashamed. And with that fear of admitting the truth, a slow and painful financial loss continues for the victims involved. The internet exposed all the vulnerabilities of the newspaper business. What circulation figures were loose, which revenue streams would not hold. It found its way into all the areas of our profession that we have held dear. Our right to decide for the public what is and what is not important, our right to sway political opinion, and most of all, our God-given right to make a profit from whatever form of journalism we dish up. The internet also appealed to the impulse that resides in most newspaper managers to eliminate costs. They fell for the con that the internet was simply a new form of the printing press, and by simply putting the content of their old product up online, they became aggregators of news instead of generators of news. In doing so, they forgot one fundamentally important thing. Information has value, but it is only of value if you are the only one with it. Businesses that don't adapt and evolve risk getting innovated out of existence, and this condescension that newspapers showed for their readers became an even bigger problem because of past condescension. For though we like to blame the internet for all our current woes, long before the internet came along, newspapers had already begun to move away from the resource-hungry area of what I like to call real journalism. This cutback in investigative reporting and hard skeptical analysis had in turn seen media outlets increasingly and unquestioningly rely on a flow of news from governments, big business, and a booming public relations industry. Like many media outlets in the US, the Australian newspapers wallowed in their long dominance over news. News managers enjoyed such power, they figured if they simply put something on the front page, then it became news, and if they ignored it, then it would fade into oblivion, and their original judgment would be justified. Somewhere along the way, some newspapers simply began pretending to do real journalism. They figured if they just tagged it the right way, then the public wouldn't really notice the difference. The saddest part about the situation is that some newspaper reporters enjoyed having things on rails. They were largely content to follow a formula that could be pushed like a cart down the tracks of the 24-hour news cycle, all the while forgetting that by the time it reaches its destination, on someone's front doorstep tomorrow morning, it has become old and stale. Instead of setting itself apart, you had a product that was 80 to 90% made up of what happened yesterday. The sad reality is that long before the dawn of the internet, we had so moved away from our core mission that something was always going to come along to call our bluff. We had turned newspapers into neat little call centres, where the audience was taken for granted, and where the rush to fill column inches as cheaply as possible proved to be very short-sighted indeed. Lucrative areas, like the motoring section, the employment section, the travel section, and the property section, became little more than advertising features. Somewhere along the line, newspaper managers forgot that good journalism requires an obligation to the reader, not to the advertiser. The rest of the newspaper fared little better. The great craft of journalism largely devolved into a sad little job that you punched in and out of, instead of digging up information on potential stories during vacation time and going into work on weekends. We lost our passion. We so forgot about our primary obligation to the public, the obligation to act as a watchdog, to shine a light into dark places, to right wrongs, to represent the unrepresented, and to stand up for truth and integrity, that we suddenly found we had lost much of our relevance and much of our credibility. And pretty soon, lucrative areas like the motoring advertising, the employment advertising, the travel advertising, and the property advertising migrated online, because there was so little reason to stay in print. For too long, newspapers stood by as readership of the print product was allowed to slide. For too long, newspapers asked how they could regain the ascendancy, instead of asking themselves what indispensable role they could play in the lives of the community they claimed to serve. The internet truly exposed the fallacy of pretending to be a thing you are not. By not recognizing the challenge for what it was, newspapers were left feeling ashamed. And with that fear of admitting the truth, a slow and painful financial loss continues for everyone involved. But despite the speed and magnitude of the decline of the newspaper empire, it should not be forgotten in all the hand-wringing that most newspaper companies are still in a good position to overcome this latest threat. They are still in a good position to overcome by innovation, in much the same way that the threats of radio and television were once overcome by innovation. Despite declining circulations, many daily newspapers still produce profits that other industries eye with envy. The content of newspapers is still followed by television and radio, and it now provides the basic material for numerous independent bloggers and for numerous news aggregation websites. There are some notable exceptions, but the current downturn hasn't always translated into doing badly. Until recently, many newspapers, both here and in Australia, had profit margins exceeding 30%. By 2008, reports suggest the industry's average margin had fallen to about 15%, but this still exceeds margins for other industries that often struggle to reach 10%. Newspapers continue to have huge advantages in many aspects of their business, such as reputation and their ability to distribute news. They still have highly trained workforces, or at least those that remain. The display advertising and the classified advertising that powered the newspaper business model for decades may be under threat, but when you stop to think of that, it only shows that there is a real commercial value in delivering accurate and timely news and information. The form of delivery may change in the future, but by building new communities, the potential audience for our content will multiply many times over, and you would have to think that profits would too. Without a doubt, an old order is dying, but a potentially larger, more complex and vital new order has every chance of emerging from the wreckage through the delivery of news on our web pages, through an altered print product, through RSS feeds and paid searchable databases, through delivering customized news and advertising to mobile phones and other handheld devices. And we should feel a sense of great excitement rather than a great fear to be given a chance to fundamentally alter the course of the future. There is no doubt that once we get our side of the ledger in order, the business side will follow. I have no doubt that this will require vision, but no more than the vision that transformed the music industry when the iPod first came along. I have no doubt it will require imagination, but no more than that shown by companies like Ryanair when, not so long ago, the airline industry was said to be at death's door. The old ways of doing newspaper journalism needs to change. I have no doubt about that. The notions that newspapers can grind on under the weight of a strong agenda while pretending they don't have one. The notion that newspapers can be depositories of self-importance and arbiters of all that is right and wrong. The notion that newspapers should follow outmoded schedules and outmoded forms of story delivery. All these things have no place in the future. But the future does not have to be an unhappy place. Here's what needs to be done. The existing newspaper newsroom needs to be rent asunder. The formula-driven way of doing things needs to be torn apart. We need to free ourselves of the daily grind of morning meetings and afternoon meetings and unstructured planning meetings, and instead begin to greet each day as an opportunity to greet the community we represent, using the technology that up to now we have viewed mostly as a threat. We have to free ourselves of daily deadlines as much as humanly possible. That might mean less volume, but the less of what we do will be done better. The change should start with how journalists think about their readers. We have to stop our condescension. We have to look to the past and ask ourselves what made us relevant and compulsory in the first place. We need to think once again that all things are possible, and, above all else, our readers need to rediscover a sense of surprise from our product. We have to identify the issues that people really care about and concentrate on those. And we need to embrace the internet as a new tool that allows us to achieve that. The internet allows more means of communication than could ever be imagined by that mainstay of modern journalism, the telephone, and yet many modern newspaper journalists blindly ignore this new reality. Instead, they use the technology to try to produce bad television and bad radio, in the mistaken belief that this is what is required in the new internet environment. It seems clear now that leading news brands of the future, in whatever form they take, will be those that can create communities around their content. This means transforming our audiences into active participants in the daily cycle and allowing them to shape content that is relevant, interesting and useful to them. For instance, we should embrace the concept of reverse publishing, where we tell our communities what we intend to publish before we publish it, in order that they can contribute and improve the final product. In this way, we would build platforms that would allow communities to form without forgetting that the final product will still need to arrive with lots of surprises. Whatever the rights and wrongs of WikiLeaks, newspapers need to quickly wake up to the message it poses. Whistleblowers once trusted newspapers, enough to make them their first port of call. The lesson from WikiLeaks is that that trust with the community has been broken through past condescension. Every newspaper should therefore immediately develop its own form of WikiLeaks that would openly court and seek to protect whistleblowers big and small, because good sources are the lifeblood of agenda-setting journalism. Every newspaper should construct databases of information that should rival national security agencies, and we should apply that accumulated knowledge in every single piece of journalism the newspaper produces. We should reconsider the relevance of that mainstay of newspaper journalism, the beat reporter. Not that they should be wiped from the future, but the question should be asked, how many are merely a legacy of the past? We should ensure that a majority of reporters in every newsroom be managed separately, but intensely off diary, employed to get stories that nobody else has. The approach adopted should be about making judgments on what is important several days or even months in advance, and where all the work you present is adding real value to the lives of the community that you serve, or are setting an agenda for that community. We should re-embrace long-form journalism, recognising that the technology that allows people to rediscover the joys of this form are already here. The yesterday events should be presented only in enough detail to satisfy the minority of readers who want their newspaper to be one of record. If we agree now that the value of journalism is only incorporated in the way other people feel about it, that once it is presented, it will acquire meaning only in what it did for its audience, then there is no doubt that the future for that odd couple, newspapers and the internet, need to progress towards a happy union. I'm optimistic that it will happen. I'm optimistic that the knowledge, the leadership and the innovation required will come to the fore. But newspapers must first back a commitment to change with action in the one area that we still control, the editorial product itself. Business as usual will not suffice. Being optimistic in itself will not suffice. And it is clear now that cutting costs and hoping that the hurricane will pass will not work either. Let us be optimistic. Let us be optimistic, but let us agree now that we hold in our hands a legacy too important to be killed off by our own inactions. Thank you.